This is exactly how I would rise above the routine of a 9 to 5 existence to create a fortune of my own, not merely through wealth, but through mastery of influence itself. Machiavelli once wrote that fortune is a woman, and if you wish to command her, you must treat her boldly. He wasn't speaking about luck. He was describing audacity, the courage to stop obeying and start leading. I know this because I once lived the obedient life. I earned a modest income, followed the rules, waited for permission, and drowned in silent resentment. But the day I stopped waiting for fortune to favor me and decided to seize her, everything changed. If I could return to that earlier version of myself, trapped beneath fluorescent lights and a stable paycheck, I'd tell him the first step isn't about quitting your job. It's about reprogramming your mindset. A man's wealth is a reflection of his chosen ability, his weapon in the arena of life. Machiavelli taught that every prince must possess two, the ability to impose his will upon uncertain circumstances. In our time, that means discovering your Machiavellian skill, the discipline or craft that gives you leverage over others. Go to work, yes, but study the kind of work that multiplies power. So here's what I would do. Open your mind like a strategist. Go to Google, your modern library of Florence, and type professions of millionaires. You'll see a predictable list. Entrepreneurs, investors, lawyers, engineers, financiers, creators. Now don't skim it. Build a grid. Rate each one according to your natural interest and existing skill. Where curiosity meets capability, you'll find your first seat of power. When I did this exercise years ago, I realized I lacked the patience for engineering, the credentials for law, and a desire to obey any boss long enough to climb a corporate ladder. So I turned toward entrepreneurship, not because I thought it was glamorous, but because it was the swiftest path to sovereignty, like a prince taking a crumbling castle and deciding to rebuild it in his own image. I wanted control, even if it meant risk. But this path demands a harsher choice: isolation. You cannot build an empire surrounded by the powerless. The second step is ruthless. You must sever ties with the uninspired. Machiavelli warned that a ruler's downfall often begins with poor alliances, and I learned this the hard way. When I first announced I was building my own business, I expected support. What I received was mockery. My friends laughed, doubted, ignored, and dismissed me, not out of malice, but because my ambition threatened their comfort. I remember speaking passionately about what I was learning, the books I was reading, the nights I stayed awake sketching plans. They'd change the subject. They'd talk about gossip, television, and distractions that kept them numb. I realized my growth had made me a foreigner in my own circle. It wasn't personal. It was biological. Evolution rewards those who adapt and punishes those who cling to familiar. So I withdrew. It was lonely, yes, but that loneliness became the forge. Every man who seeks greatness must experience exile before ascension. Napoleon was exiled before becoming emperor again. Machiavelli himself wrote The Prince while banished from Florence, stripped of influence. Yet his exile birthed ideas that outlived kings. Your separation from mediocrity is the same trial. The weak call it loneliness. The strong call it preparation. Here's the truth no one tells you. Your energy is limited and your circle consumes it. Every conversation that doesn't align with your future weakens your control over it. The poor will drag you into despair disguised as realism. The mediocre will mock your ambition to justify their own failure. You must protect your mind the way a prince guards his fortress. Every gate closed, every wall fortified. When I cut off those who ridicule my ambitions, I didn't just lose friends. I gained clarity, silence, focus, a mental vacuum I could finally fill with knowledge, power, and strategy. That's when the real transformation began. Once you remove the noise of the crowd, your own voice becomes audible again. You start to think, not like an employee, but like a ruler preparing his first conquest. But here's the dilemma Machiavelli would warn you about. Isolation without guidance breeds delusion. Once you remove the weak, you must replace them with the strong. The next stage of your rise demands proximity to power, to those already living the life you desire. That's how power transfers, not through luck, but through imitation of masters. That brings us to your next move, the strategic replacement of your circle with mentors, models, and millionaires who already hold the keys to the kingdom. Because proximity, as Machiavelli knew, is the shadow of influence. Whoever you stand beside long enough, you will eventually become. Once you've silenced mediocrity, fill that void with intelligence, ambition, and example. Machiavelli observed that men almost always follow the beaten path, and by imitation, they achieve what others before them have achieved. The modern version of that truth is simple. Your proximity determines your destiny. If you wish to rise among princes, stand where princes stand. So here's your next step. Replace broke friends with wealthy teachers. Reflect on the hierarchy of influence in your life. The average man seeks validation from those beneath him because it's easier to be admired than corrected. The ambitious man seeks counsel from those who can sharpen his mind like a blade. In the age of algorithms, your environment extends beyond your neighborhood. It's what you consume, who you follow, and whose language you begin to adopt. When I began shaping my new circle, I made a list, 10 names of people who had already built the life I wanted. Not celebrities, not dreamers, strategists. In the Renaissance, ambitious men did the same. They apprenticed under masters, studied their techniques, and learned not only their skills but their temperament. The Medici trained merchants and artists alike. They didn't just build wealth, they engineered dynasties. Today, that same method applies. The wealthy you admire have left behind a breadcrumb trail of psychology and systems. Study it, obsess over it. But Machiavelli offers a warning. Admiration without transformation is worship. Don't study to become a fan. Study to become a rival. When I first modeled my mentors, I didn't imagine sitting beside them. I imagined surpassing them. That shift from admiration to competition activated my inner strategist. When you view the powerful not as gods, but as men who simply played the game longer, you stop being intimidated and start learning like a predator, tracking its prey. That's how I studied the modern elites, not as idols, but as architects. How does Jeff Bezos think about time? How does Warren Buffett define patience? How does Elon Musk use debt as a weapon? These aren't just billionaires, they're contemporary princes, men who understood that wealth is not earned, it's engineered. Each of them followed Machiavelli's principle. The wise man does at once what the fool does finally. They act with speed and certainty while others hesitate and seek permission. Now let's talk about time, the next pillar of transformation. Learn to treat time as your sovereign asset. Machiavelli wrote that a prince must never waste daylight waiting for opportunity, because idleness is the ally of decay. Translated for today, your mornings, nights, and weekends aren't for recovery. They're for preparation. The common man burns hours scrolling, watching, waiting. The ruler in training studies builds and calculates. When I was still working a 9 to 5, I consumed knowledge the way most people consume entertainment. Podcasts while driving, audiobooks in the gym, notes scribbled at red lights. You must turn your life into an academy of self-education. Every spare moment either compounds or decays your potential. But here's where most fail. They fill their minds with information, yet never set targets. The prince always governs toward a specific conquest, not vague ambition. If your goal is to build wealth, define the realm you'll rule: business, real estate, investing, media. Every hour spent outside that domain is a diversion disguised as productivity. Focus breeds momentum. Momentum builds authority. And authority, in any field, is currency. Still, studying from a distance can only take you so far. There comes a moment when you must step into the arena, into the spaces where power circulates. In Machiavelli's Florence, power was traded in private salons and courts. Today, it happens at conferences, masterminds, and investor gatherings. These are your modern palaces. To reach them, you must pay an entry fee, not in flattery, but in investment. And this brings you to your next threshold, the one separating thinkers from doers. The path to wealth is not built by hoarding, but by deploying. You cannot accumulate fortune without first risking what you hold. While the masses view debt as danger, Machiavelli would call it a weapon, a calculated gamble that forces transformation. There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, he wrote, nor more perilous to conduct, nor more uncertain in its success than to introduce a new order things. In other words, revolution. personal or financial, demands risk. The question isn't whether you can afford it, but whether you can afford not to act. And so, as you prepare for your next stage, you'll face that moment when ambition outgrows your wallet. Opportunity will knock, but the price will terrify you. That's the test. The trial separating students of wealth from its masters. By now, you've studied the powerful, reshaped your circle, and begun to think like a strategist instead of spectator. But here's where most fall, at the altar of fear. They hesitate when it's time to pay the price. Machiavelli wrote, "It is not titles that honor men, but men who honor titles." In other words, wealth and power don't sanctify you. You sanctify them through bold action. The modern prince must treat money not as safety, but as weaponry. When I first heard this principle, it frightened me. I was raised, like most, to worship safety, save money, avoid risk, fear debt. But Machiavelli understood, and every modern magnate confirms, comfort destroys conquest. A prince who fears spending will never build a fortress strong enough to withstand attack. That's why the wealthy see investment differently, not as loss, but as transformation. The act of deploying capital, whether money, time, or reputation, is what forges the next version of yourself. I remember the first time I made a high-risk investment in myself. It wasn't comfortable. It was a $4,000 marketing course. At a time, I couldn't afford it. But I knew stagnation was more expensive. I thought of Machiavelli's words. Fortune favors the bold, and she's more often won by the impetuous than by those who go to work coldly. That single decision forced me into a new psychological state where failure was an option. Debt became the battlefield that demanded victory. In the modern world, this principle is everywhere. Elon Musk sold nearly everything he owned, even mortgages homes, to fund Tesla when investors mocked him. The Medici borrowed heavily to finance ventures that lifted their family from merchants to monarchs. Alexander the Great burned his ships, so his men had no path but forward. These men understood the dark truth Machiavelli hinted at. Necessity breeds greatness. When you remove your escape routes, the only direction left is domination. The weak see debt as chains. The strong see it as a sword. That's why I tell anyone serious about rising. Get into rooms that stretch you financially. Pay to attend the conferences where your heroes speak. Join masterminds that make your stomach tighten when you swipe the card, not because the event itself makes you rich, but because it forces you to become worthy of that investment. Every time I entered such a room, I did so trembling, unworthy, unknown. But in those rooms, my ambition sharpened. Proximity to greatness is uncomfortable, but that discomfort is the price of admission to power. In those gatherings, you begin to see the difference between ordinary men and empire builders. The average attendee takes notes. The future millionaire observes behavior, language, posture. Who commands attention? Who speaks little but with precision? Who controls a crowd without raising their voice? These are the subtle mechanics of power. Machiavelli advised that a ruler should observe the habits of great men and imitate what works, even the ruthless parts. You study not just what they say, but what they withhold. You learn to read silence as strategy. Before each event, I made a rule: I must have something of value to discuss. I gave myself 3 months to create something worth mentioning, a new offer, a product, a milestone, because the powerful respect movement, not potential. When I finally stood before those I admired, I wasn't there to take selfies. I was there to signal value. That shift from consumer to contributor is when doors began to open. There's a Machiavellian law at play here. A wise prince must contrive that his citizens always have need of the state, and then they will remain faithful. Translated, make people need you. Build something the powerful want access to, and you'll never beg for connection again. That's how influence is forged. Once you're in a room, your mission isn't to meet everyone. It's to identify the few who can change your trajectory. Before every event, I researched obsessively who would be there, what they built, what they wanted. My motto was simple: be the educated hunter. Preparation is power. Most show up unarmed, hoping for luck. The Machiavellian shows up with insight, precision, and intent. That's how alliances are born, not by chance, but by calculation. You'll start to see the same dynamic that shaped Renaissance Florence or Wall Street today. everyone pretending to be allies, but silently measuring who is worth aligning with. Don't resent it. Master it. You're not there to be liked. You're there to be remembered. Still, one ability determines whether you can convert proximity into profit. The power of persuasion. Machiavelli called influence a weapon sharper than any sword. The art of ruling minds, not through force, but through belief. Because no empire, political or financial, was ever built without persuasion. And that's where the next law begins. You must master the art of influence, or be ruled by those who have. Every modern prince, from Bezos to Buffett, is a salesman in disguise. Every fortune begins as a conversation. Every kingdom begins as a pitch. By now, you've taken risks, invested in yourself, and entered the rooms where power circulates. But standing among the mighty isn't enough. You must command. Machiavelli taught that the first way to judge a ruler's intelligence is to examine the men around him. In our world, this translates to influence. Your capacity to persuade others to follow your vision, buy your product, or invest in your idea. The richest men alive aren't just investors or inventors. They are persuaders. They move minds, redirect capital, and bend entire markets to their will. This is why the next law of ascension is sales, the forgotten language of power. You must learn to sell yourself, your vision, your worth. The timid call it arrogance. The wise call it survival. From Machiavelli's Florence to modern Silicon Valley, persuasion remains the invisible currency of empires. Jeff Bezos sold investors on a dream of a digital library before he had profit. Steve Jobs sold identity before he sold devices. Even Machiavelli himself, exiled from Florence, sold the prince as a redemption manual to his former enemies. That's the power of words used as weapons. I remember the first time I understood this truth. I had knowledge, I had effort, but I lacked influence. And influence is what transforms effort into income. So I immersed myself in the psychology of sales, not the manipulative kind, but the strategic kind. It's the art of seeing into another's desires and positioning yourself as a bridge between their pain and their relief. Machiavelli would call this the mastery of human nature. Knowing what people truly want, not what they claim to. Men are driven by two impulses, he wrote, either by love or by fear. The best salesmen know how to use both. You must first sell yourself to yourself. If you don't believe in your craft, your tone will betray you. The uncertain voice trembles. The committed voice commands. When I finally internalized that, everything changed. My message became sharper, my confidence unshakable, and opportunities began to appear. You cannot lead others to believe in you until you've conquered your own doubt. Once you master persuasion, the next step is precision. Wealth, contrary to myth, isn't mystical, it's mathematical. Machiavelli would agree. Fortune controls half of our actions, but leaves the other half in our power. The half you control is measurement, your metrics, your discipline, your arithmetic of conquest. You cannot rule what you don't measure. So define your targets like a general mapping his campaign. If your goal is $1 million, don't dream it, calculate it. $1 million is simply $2,740 per day. From there, reverse engineer your path. How many clients, products, or deals will it take? Break it down until ambition becomes measurable. When I did this, the fog lifted. I stopped hoping and started tracking. Every day had an objective. Every failure became a data point. In the arithmetic of ambition, consistency becomes destiny. But even with precision, resistance will appear, fatigue, doubt, rejection. Machiavelli warned, there is nothing more difficult to begin, no more doubtful success, than to introduce a new order of things. Every rise tests how much you truly desire it. Most men surrender, not because it's too hard, but because they forget their why. That's where the final law begins, the discipline of hunger. Wake each day remembering you're not yet who you could be. When I look at my account, I don't see numbers. I see distance. Between the man I am and the man I must become. Machiavelli called this tension necessity, the force that turns ambition into genius. Each morning, look at your goals, then at your reality. Feel the gap. Don't numb it. Use it. It's proof that you're alive and still in the game. The weak call that gap failure. The strong call it fire. When I began this ritual, reviewing vision against reality. It kept my mind ruthless. It reminded me that comfort is the enemy of greatness. The moment you stop feeling that hunger, the world begins to pass you by. So remember, wealth isn't just a number. It's a mirror reflecting your capacity for mastery, risk, and resilience. To command your life like a prince, you must think like one, strategically, calmly, yet with purpose burning beneath the surface. The men who become millionaires don't worship fortune. They wield her. They don't wait for permission. They take it. Your potential, as Machiavelli would say, lies not in virtue as the world defines it, but in the virtue that bends chaos to your will. Fortune tests every man, but she ultimately yields to those who dare to strike her with precision, patience, and power. And if you wish to channel that hunger into a life of strategic abundance, to build a fortune that cannot be taken, watch the next video right here by subscribing. Because the next law of wealth isn't about money at all. It's about dominion.